thank you very much, Maynard, for those very kind and generous remarks. I want to thank you for your friendship and support for these many years as well. You'll probably be disappointed to know that the talk I'm giving tonight is the same one I gave at the United Nations 18 years ago. Thank you also, Larry and Brent and David and Connie for being here to respond, and thank you to all the members of the Washington Theological Consortium. It's an honor for me to be here. Well, as Maynard pointed out, much of my career in science and religion has been devoted to the question of what possible sense can we make of faith in the context of our new understanding of the universe, our new scientific story of the universe in particular. It's always been a problem, but we do know, as you pointed out, that cosmology does give a certain shape to faith and theology, and when the cosmology changes, inevitably the shape of faith and theology also change. Some years ago, about 200, a little more than 200 years ago, the great philosopher Immanuel Kant said that all thoughtful people should ask at least three big questions. What can I know? What must I do? And what can I hope for? If he were here today, however, in the light of geology, biology, cosmology, and our new understanding of the universe that's still coming into being, I think he would have to ask a fourth really big question. What in the world is going on in this process? And what I want to ask is, what does faith and theology, if anything, have to do with this question of what could be possibly going on in the universe? Another way of asking that is to ask if anything significant, anything of lasting significance is working itself out in the universe. And what could that possibly be? And it's in that context that I want to ask the question, what is the possible cosmic meaning of faith? We talk about faith in so many disciplines: psychology, sociology, theology, biology, history, and so forth. But what does faith look like if we place it in the context of cosmology? This is something that Kant could not do. For Kant, the universe is simply a stage or a backdrop for the human drama. It's not something we could focus on. But after Einstein, after Darwin first, but after Einstein especially, we are now able, for the first time in human history, to focus on the cosmos itself, the universe itself, as a set of interrelated things. And everything looks different if we place it within the context of this cosmic story. One of the really interesting things, and this has happened within my own intellectual career, this was not something people talked about at all when I first started teaching science and religion at Georgetown back around 1970. And that's how closely we now realize that what we call mind and thought are tied to the physics of the universe. And that has emboldened me to talk about the universe as having an insideness to it. So if we start with our own experience here tonight, of our own minds working, your own inquisitiveness, your own asking questions and so forth, reflect on your own consciousness and ask what that has to do with the cosmos. We know something about that we didn't know 30, 40 years ago. We know, in a way that Immanuel Kant certainly did not, how intricately the fact of mind is tied into a complex physical thing we call the brain. Science tells us, however, that we wouldn't have brains were it not for the fact of evolution, which complicated the brains of our primate ancestors to the point where the leap into thought could take place. But we wouldn't have evolution without life, of course, and we wouldn't have life without planets that had just the right chemical composition that allowed for the existence of life. And that chemical composition includes a lot of elements, but especially carbon, which has a special talent for bonding with other atoms and thus making organic molecules and eventually life possible. But we know something now we didn't know 30, 40, 50 years ago, and that's we can't take carbon for granted. Carbon was not always there. At the beginning of the universe, we had hydrogen and helium. but nothing like the elements that are necessary for life. To have carbon, astrophysics has taught us, we need to have massive stars, which get very, very hot at their core so that they can convert or cook the primordial hydrogen and helium into the heavier elements that are necessary for life. But we can't take these massive stars or the free hydrogen and helium for granted either. We have to go to understand what these are and their shape and their pattern. We have to go all the way back to the very first moment, the first microsecond of the universe, which we refer to as the Big Bang. And we now realize that at that time, certain values were established: the expansion rate of the universe, the gravitational coupling force, the ratio of electron to proton mass, the ratio of the weak to strong nuclear forces, the amplitude of ripples in the early universe. There are a lot of things that had to be just almost exactly right, almost within a billionth, as Stephen Hawking would say, of what they are, if eventually life and mind were going to evolve out of this process. So we see now, and I don't want to make any theological point in this, I don't want to use this as a basis for a design argument, I just simply want us to notice how intricately what's going on in your minds right now is tied into what happened at the time of the Big Bang. So this is the new thing, and this is what I think changes everything. It makes mind a different sort of thing, reality, from what Kant thought it was. For Kant, the mind is some sort of ethereal activity going on without really any serious physical connection to the cosmos itself. And so it seems that there's an inside story that's taking place in parallel with the outside story. And the proof of that insideness is the fact that your own subjectivity, your own mind itself, you and I, our minds, our thought, are just as much part of the universe as rocks and rivers. And this is an amazing new fact that almost every scientist now has come to accept as well. So if mind has this new place within the cosmos, what about faith? This is what I want to explore very briefly, and this is what I do in the book. I talk more about religion than faith, but religions are expressions of faith. So how does faith fit into the cosmos? Now, just a couple other points here. The expansion rate of the cosmos, that is how fast the cosmos expands and is still expanding, if it had differed only infinitesimally from the rate, the cosmic constant that scientists talk about, then we would have a lifeless and mindless universe. If the gravitational constant had been only infinitesimal different, a billionth or perhaps even a trillionth different from what it is, the universe would have expanded too fast or too slow. Those massive stars that cooked up carbon would never have formed. Without carbon, there'd be no life. Without life, no evolution. Without evolution, no mind. So we would have a lifeless and mindless universe in that case too. The point I'm trying to make is that thought, the fact of thought, which was something that Kant himself was obsessed with, but had no sense of the cosmic connection of thought to the universe. Thought is tied tightly to a very specific set of physical conditions and constants. And that means that mind and the universe are a package deal, and that we can no longer really talk about one without bringing the other into the picture. Well, if that's true of mind, I want to ask, what about faith? What is the connection of faith to this cosmic story? In order for faith, in order for the universe to be hospitable to faith, it would seem that there would have to be something meaningful going on in this process that we call the universe. Another way of asking the old question, is there purpose in the universe? What do I mean by purpose? By purpose, I mean simply the bringing about of something of unquestionable value. For example, we think of our own lives as having a purpose. if they're dedicated to bringing about some value, justice, peace, love, beauty, whatever. And that gets us up in the mornings. But is there anything analogous to that, something significantly working itself out in the cosmos as a whole? Or is this something that just takes place within the human sphere? Well, we used to think that, and most people used to think that. In fact, for a lot of people, the whole question of cosmic purpose has been, throughout most of modern history, a very silly question. But is it really that silly? Even back in the 40s, the American philosopher W.T. Stace was pointing out that if the whole scheme of things, if the whole cosmos is pointless, then so also are our individual lives. And very few public officials have come out like Václav Havel has in saying it's not a silly question at all, the question of cosmic purpose. In fact, he says, the crisis of the much needed global responsibility, by which he means especially ecological responsibility, is due to the fact that we've lost the sense that the universe has a purpose. It's really something worth thinking about. And if you ask the religions of the world, for the most part, I think most of them would agree that the universe is here for a reason. So in a sense, I believe that religions and faith systems stand or fall on this question of whether the universe can be called, in some sense, purposeful. However, doesn't science rule out cosmic purpose? I would say probably the majority of scientists and almost all philosophers would say that it does. Steven Weinberg is famous for saying that the more comprehensible, meaning the more scientifically comprehensible the universe has become, the more pointless it also seems. Another thoughtful 20th century physicist, Richard Feynman, said the great accumulation of understanding as to how the physical world behaves only convinces one that this behavior has a kind of meaninglessness about it. Margaret Geller, astronomer at Harvard, was asked to comment on Steven Weinberg's statement, and she says, of course, what possible point could it have? It's just a physical system. And I could quote to countless physicists. An acquaintance of mine, Lawrence Krauss, wrote in the New Yorker not too long ago that the more we learn scientifically about the workings of the universe, the more purposeless it seems. So that's probably the majority opinion in the scientific community and in the intellectual community as well. I should point out, however, there is a minority opinion in the intellectual world which says, yes, there is purpose in the universe, except for certain parts of New Jersey. Before science came along, pre-scientific thinking, pre-scientific theological cosmology was static, vertical, and hierarchical. The universe is thought of as a ladder of levels, starting with lowly matter at the bottom, then plants, then animals, then humans, and then perhaps angelic spheres, all encompassed by ultimate reality and meaning, which in theistic context we refer to as God. This scheme operated according to what's called the hierarchical principle, which maintains that in this hierarchy, a higher level can encompass or comprehend or get itself around the lower, but a lower level cannot comprehend or get itself or encompass any higher level as well. And that would mean that gaining cognitional competence at a lower level, say becoming skilled at the level of matter and physics and chemistry, would not, at least traditionally speaking, qualify you to understand what's really going on in life, let alone what's going on in mind, and let alone understand the ultimate reality and meaning. The traditional philosophical and theological systems almost all insisted that if the human mind is going to become adequate to the fullness of reality, especially the higher levels, the human person has to go through a process of personal transformation. And that was what the life of faith was about, to make you qualified, to transform you so that your mind and heart would be adequate to understand the deeper and more significant levels of reality. So this hierarchical principle works on the assumption that something which is more important and more real is also more hidden and unavailable to ordinary consciousness. You have to go through a process. And that would mean, therefore, that ultimate meaning, if it exists, would lie beyond human consciousness altogether. But human consciousness could have an awareness of being comprehended by ultimate reality. And that was at least one meaning of faith in terms of this cosmology. What faith means in terms of cosmology is expressed very nicely here. Faith is the state of allowing ourselves to be grasped by that which is ultimately more important. And even up to the modern times in the 20th century, Paul Tillich, the great Christian theologian, defined faith as a state of allowing ourselves to be grasped by that which is ultimately important. And since faith cannot speak directly of ultimate reality, it has to resort to symbolic, metaphorical, analogical language in order to talk about ultimate reality at all. But that should not be taken as a defect on the part of faith theology. It's a sign of the eminence or the excellence of what faith is talking about, that it can only talk about it in terms of symbolic language. And the life of faith, therefore, was the life of finding our way up the ladder of levels so as eventually to come into climactic communion with ultimate reality. And this way of thinking still sculpts the religious and ethical sensibilities, political and legal sensibilities of people throughout the world today. So I can't exaggerate the importance of this traditional, hierarchical way of looking at things. I'll call it the analogical way of thinking a little bit later on. And it still gives meaning to the lives of millions and millions of people. Before or after our religions became literate, they often started comparing the natural world to a book. And just as a book can be read at many different levels of meaning, so also can the universe. To a monkey, a book is just black marks on a white page. The monkey's not wrong, but it can mean more. To a child, say a 5 or 6 year old who's just learned the letters of the alphabet, the book is a treasure trove of letters of a code. The child is not wrong, and the child sees things that the monkey did not, but still the book can mean more. To an adolescent, the book might have the outlines of an adventure story, which the child and the monkey did not see. And to an adult who is seasoned by life and especially by suffering, the book can be a great expression of wisdom, which none of the others have seen. The point I'm trying to make, and the point the traditional hierarchical view is trying to make, is that personal transformation is essential to grasping what's going on. And for them, the life of faith provides the directives for this personal transformation. Whereas modern science, I think all the great traditions would say, if they were faced with this question of whether science can tell us whether there's purpose in the universe, would say that science can tell us something about the universe, but science is simply not wired to detect whether there's such a thing as cosmic purpose and whether there's room for faith in the universe. But one book we now know as a result of science is not nearly enough to represent the scale and the depth and the complexity of what science has now taught us about the universe. When I taught science and religion at Georgetown, I used to ask my students to imprint this image on their minds and take it with them throughout the whole semester. And I use this in almost every talk I give on science and religion. Some of you have seen this before, but maybe some of you haven't. I asked my students to imagine that they had on their bookshelf 30 big volumes, and each of those volumes is 450 pages long, and each page stands for 1 million years in the story. The Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1. But notice that the first two shelves are part of the third. Consists of essentially lifeless and mindless material stuff and lifeless and mindless physical processes. Life was not in a hurry to come into this universe. The Earth and the other planets spun out around the sun about 4.5 billion years ago. But it took another billion years before life began to glow. Not very enthusiastically on our planet, life remained in pretty much a single-celled status until you get almost to the end of volume 29. That's where the famous Cambrian explosion takes place. And at this point, life suddenly becomes much more complex at an accelerated pace. Still, dinosaurs don't come in until after the middle of volume 30. They go extinct on page 385 or 386. And it's only in those last pages of the last volume, volume 30, that mammalian life begins to flourish. Eventually primates come in. And when do we come in? Humans, endowed with intelligence, with the capacity for faith, the capacity for ethical aspiration, and a sense of purpose. We don't come in until almost the last bottom of the last page of the very last volume. Which means that thoughtful people cannot help asking, what's going on here? Kant did not have to ask this question. He had no sense of the context within which life, mind, and faith were nurtured. If you're Bertrand Russell, you would say perhaps, as he did, that if the point of this story was to produce intelligence, then why did it take so long to produce so little? So, to ask whether there's a meaning to it all is to ask whether there's some sort of narrative thread that can tie together what's going on page 1 of volume 1 with what's going on page 450 of volume 30. Is there some narrative, some story we can tell that can bring a kind of narrative coherence to this picture of the universe and any other volumes that will surely be written in the future. For all we know, these 30 volumes are only the dawn of the eventual coming into being of this universe. How things have changed, and therefore how our understanding of ourselves has changed, and of course, how our understanding of faith has to change as well. One of the questions that has come up in modern times, especially in the last 200 years, is hasn't science made the universe look like a desert, lifeless and mindless? Because notice what happens to that classical hierarchy of levels. Matter, which was the lowest level in the traditional hierarchy, now becomes the dominant feature in this new cosmography. Lifeless and mindless matter. Life comes in as a kind of fluke, so many scientists now believe, very late in the story. And mind shows up only as a kind of afterthought on page 450 of volume 30. And meaning, or purpose, which was the highest level of all in traditional classical vertical hierarchy, meaning now in modern and postmodern thought seems to many intellectuals, academics, and journalists, and just many educated people in general, meaning seems to be nothing more than a concoction, a construct or an illusion or fiction that we humans invent to coat over the coldness of the universe to make it seem a little bit warmer than it really is. So, this is our situation. The universe, for many people to this day, now seems dead because of science. And if it's dead, how can it be a nursery or a habitat for purpose and meaning and faith? What then would faith mean if we took seriously this new picture of the universe? Before I get into that, I want to say a few more words about how the universe died in the first place, in our minds and in our hearts. There are different ways of telling the story. Very briefly, here's Hans Jonas's version. Hans Jonas, a brilliant Jewish philosopher, points out that before science came along, most human cultures were pan-vitalistic. That is, they believed that everything, pan, is alive. Everything is alive. Not just animals and plants, but rivers, streams, mountains, and rocks, everything pulsed with life in one way or another. Even philosophers, before science came along, thought that all things are filled with an animating principle. Thales, the pre-Socratic philosopher, says this. Even Aristotle, who's probably more secular than most ancient philosophers, when he looked up and saw the stars twinkling at night, assumed that they're animated by spiritual principles. So the point is, for the pan-vitalist, before the scientific revolution, before the Renaissance, and before the Age of Reason, life is the norm, and death is the unintelligible exception. Death seemed, for so many centuries of our human existence on this planet, to be essentially unreal, even an illusion. So if you imagine yourself being part of a prehistoric, pre-scientific tribe or people, and somebody in your clan or tribe died, and you see the corpse lying before you, or the inert body of an animal that you love, you see that inertness there. What are the thoughts that go through your mind? Jonah says, for the pan-vitalist, the problem was, how can anything be dead if everything is alive? And the answer is, it can't be. That there is some life principle that was present in the animal or human that still lives on in the hidden world of spirit and comes back to haunt or to console or whatever, but it's still around. And it was this animistic thinking that provided the remote background of almost all the main religious traditions that still believe that there's some other dimension than the physical, and that the divine inhabits that dimension. But then, jumping way ahead here, the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and science came along. What happened is that pan-vitalism gave way to materialism, the view that matter, lifeless matter, is all there really is. This happened, intellectual historians tell us, to a great extent because of the figure of René Descartes, who is famous for telling us that there are two very different kinds of being or substance. There's thinking substance, res cogitans, which we call the mind, and there's extended substance, measurable substance, res extensa, the realm of matter. And right there, you see a problem, because if mind is on one side of the divide and matter is on the other, then that implies logically that matter is essentially mindless, lifeless, and measurable. Now, after Descartes, who still believed that mind is real, increasingly mind dropped out of the picture as kind of an epiphenomenon. It's not really real, and only matter remains as ontologically real. And E.A. Burt and other intellectual historians tell us that this realm of mindless, lifeless, measurable material stuff became the philosophical foundation of much modern thought. And what happens to life and mind? Well, they become reducible simply to states, interesting states of lifeless and mindless matter. And so the modern problematic, the problem after pan-vitalism was wiped away, became just the opposite of the pan-vitalist problem. For the pan-vitalist, the problem is, how can you explain how anything is dead if everything is alive? Now the question, and it seems to haunt the halls of almost every academic institution in the world today, and defines the research agenda of so much human thought, how can we explain life if everything is dead? So Hans Jonas, and then later, or before Jonas, and maybe Jonas got this expression from Paul Tillich, referred to this way of looking at reality as an ontology of death. Ontology means a study of what is really real. The ontology of death says that dead stuff is the really real. And as Jonas says, deadness is the intelligible par excellence in the new way of looking at things. So within this framework, within this intellectual framework, what place for faith? How are we going to understand faith? It's been very, very difficult. I can just give a couple of examples of how difficult it has been. Most of you are familiar with the British poet Matthew Arnold. In the 19th century, the emergence of scientific materialism was making it extremely difficult for sensitive people, many of whom had in their youth been quite devout believers. It made it very difficult for them to hold on to their faiths. Just a few lines from Arnold. The sea of faith, he complains, was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, a cozy world encircled by faith. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Brilliant images of the ultimate deadness that underlies everything. So what are we supposed to do with our lives then, if that's the nature of reality? Well, love is still possible, according to Arnold. So he says to his beloved, who's looking out at Dover Beach with him, "Love, let us be true to one another. For the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." Another 19th century poet has given us what I think is one of the most beautiful poems in the English language, but it reflects his experience that the death of nature has made hope and faith extremely difficult for him, and has made the whole idea of God very problematic. This is his poem, The Darkling Thrush, and you notice it was published in 1899, right at the end of the 19th century. "I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre gray, and winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. The tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires." Again, humans can huddle together and find some warmth within this darkness. And some really interesting images. The land's sharp features seem to be the century's corpse outlined. His crypt, the cloudy canopy, the wind, his death lament. The ancient pulse of germ and birth, that panvitalist view of things, was shrunken hard and dry. And every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. But then a faint signal of hope emerges. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead, in a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things, afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy good night air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware. Whenever I read this poem, I think of a human version of an aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast beruffled plume, who, not when frost was spectre gray, but when thought was spectre gray, had chosen to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. And to me, that's in a way what Teilhard has been, as I've thought about these things. Teilhard de Chardin, famous Jesuit paleontologist who was born in 1881, died in 1955, but sought within this new picture of an emerging universe still coming into being, saw signs of hope there that others hadn't seen and that most scientific thinkers still fail to see. What he saw in the universe after Darwin, after geology, after Einstein, he saw that the universe is still a-borning. And it might be very early in the birth process. But in any case, the universe is not something stationary, something eternally static from eon to eon, but something in which something is stirring, something's happening, something new is coming onto the scene. And he thought that in terms of this new understanding of the universe that science is giving us, that faith need not be thought of as a flight from the universe or necessarily as an illusion in which we project our wishes onto things, but that faith could be a whole new stage in the awakening universe, which began to awake with the emergence of life, then with the emergence of mind, and then he saw in the world of religion and faith, not necessarily illusion. There's a lot of illusion in it. There's a lot of childishness in it. But there's also an awakening going on, which he thought to be necessary to the future of the cosmos. So he's giving us a whole new way of locating faith within the context of the universe. Traditional spirituality, unfortunately, had an impulse to leave this world behind. And that's forgivable because for the most part, human existence in the universe has been a very hard place in which to live. Nature has been very nasty, and life has been brutish and short at times. So he's not being critical here, but he's saying something is going on now that was not going on in the past. The traditional spirituality tempted us to leave this world behind to find communion with God in some other world. But when science, especially after Darwin and after Einstein, came along, Teilhard was a geologist himself, so he had a really deep sense of the time factor in the emergence of the universe. Science now tells us that this world is still coming into being. And that's what changes everything, including for faith. This world, we now see has a future that we knew nothing about, that Immanuel Kant knew nothing about when he gave his instructions as to how thoughtful people should think. This world has a future, and that's the meaning of an unfinished universe. However, if we start believing, he thought, that this world is all there is, which is what that's the definition of naturalism, the view that nature is all there is, that's not very helpful either, because we know from science that this universe is eventually going to go down the slopes of entropy into the abyss of nothingness. So the problem with naturalism, Teilhard thought, is naturalists don't love the universe enough. If you really love something, you want it to last. So what he tried to do, and what I've tried to do in my own work in science and religion, is to examine whether there might be an alternative to the God up above, which we associate with the hierarchical vertical universe, and this universe that is still coming into being. This was a lifelong problem or question for Teilhard, and it has been a lifelong question for me as well, an ongoing question, and one that I'm still working on. So the way I would formulate the issue is as follows, and this is a kind of synopsis of some of the points that I make in the new book, The New Cosmic Story. The question that I ask there is, can we find any kind of meaning and therefore a place for faith, a realistic place, not an illusory one, in terms of this new cosmic story? And I think that there are three main answers to that question. Three ways of reading the story. Three ways of trying to locate the place of faith within the scheme of things. The first I call the archaeonomic, the second the analogical, and the third the anticipatory ways of reading this new cosmic story. The term archaeonomic I devised from two Greek terms, arche and nomos. Arche means beginning, so it takes us back to the point of origins. And nomos is the word for law. The archaeonomic way of reading this universe, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what's going on in the universe, says if you want to understand it, you have to go all the way back to the beginning and then trace the series of impersonal natural causes that led step by step over 3.8 billion years to the situation we have right now. That's the archaeonomic view. So it digs back into the past. I used to call it the archaeological view, but I didn't want to disparage that wonderful discipline of archaeology. So I call it the archaeonomic view. But we could also call it the analytical view or the atomistic view, because since we can't literally go back to the past to understand the early stage of the universe, what we can do is take present phenomena and analyze them, that is, break them down into their subordinate components. And as we get into the more fine-grained analysis, we come to territory that resembles very closely the earliest phases of the cosmic process as well. So analysis, analytical thinking, is almost always, in a way, based on a quiet, tacit metaphysics, which says that the really real and the really intelligible is what happened way, way back in the past. And most scientific thinking and almost all philosophical thinking endorses the analytical, archaeonomic way of looking at things to try to make sense of them. We can associate this way of thinking with the ancient pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus, who said all you need to understand the universe are two concepts, atoms and the void. And everything that's going on in the universe is simply a reshuffling of these atoms in the context of empty space. And reconfiguring things, reshuffling throughout time. That's one very, very popular way of making sense of our world today. In fact, it's the dominant approach, I believe, in the intellectual world. Traditionally, however, there was another way of making sense of things, which I call the analogical vision. And this view maintains that if you want to understand the world around us, look at everything as a kind of analogy or sacrament pointing to the perfection of God and of the eternal now, the eternal present. And that's the origin of everything that exists in a shadowy, imperfect way in our empirical world of time and becoming. So the meaning of things then is to symbolize what lies above in the eternal present. It's a beautiful vision of things, and I think probably in the religious world, this is still the favorite way of trying to make sense of things. We can associate this view not so much with Christianity, however, as with Plato. And early in the history of Christianity, when Christianity was trying to make sense of the world, it became very Platonic in many ways. In many ways, it lost touch with the biblical origins of Christianity. I'll come back to that in a moment. So there's a third approach, which I call the anticipatory approach, and this is the one I argue for in my book. And this approach says we have to face the fact that the universe is still coming into being. And that means, since the universe is a story that's still unfolding, we can't make sense of this story without looking up ahead. And that means adopting a posture of waiting patience, of bridled expectation, of not being too impatient to understand exactly what's going on. That seems to me to be the most realistic way of reading this new story, and I'll explain why I say that a little bit later. So we can associate this view with another ancient figure, that of Abraham, who is asked by his God to leave the home of his ancestors and to take the risk of moving into the unknown, into the not yet of the future. So the anticipatory view identifies the really real, not with the past, not with the eternal now, but with that which is in some sense not yet. And it's the pull of the not yet that is so exciting, I think, about this new way of looking at the universe. So to summarize then, the archaeonomic view, the analytical worldview, sees the story. In fact, it was analysis, scientific analysis, that helped us uncover the stages that led to this Big Bang theory of the universe. It sees the story vaguely, but no meaning in it. The analogical sees meaning in things, but ignores the story as almost unimportant and inconsequential. Whereas the anticipatory view sees the story, but insists that to be realistic, we have to wait for its meaning and not be too impatient to get to it. Meaning in this context would not take the shape of mathematical excellence or architectural design, but meaning, as is the case with every story, would take the shape of narrative coherence. So understanding the universe requires the same kind of disposition that we have to have when we read, say, a great novel or story, or when we attend a play or drama. We don't walk out after the first or second act and pretend that we know what it's about. We have to wait. Likewise, if you read The Brothers Karamazov or any other great novel, you don't know what's going on until you're more than halfway through the book. Then you start seeing the coherence gradually emerging. If our universe is a story, as I think it is, then shouldn't we adopt the same disposition with respect to our question of whether there's purpose and what that purpose might be? The first view we can refer to as cosmic pessimism. It denies that there's any purpose at all in the universe. The second, the analogical, we could call otherworldly optimism. Eventually, doesn't care much about what's going on in the universe at all, as long as we can get out of it and find our destiny in the eternity of God. And the Abrahamic view, I don't know what name to give it, let's call it cosmic patience. So that leaves me with a question then, which of these three readings would seem to make the most sense? Well, let's look at them a little more carefully, and I'll end with this. The analogical reading still seems extremely attractive, probably to most people. And part of the reason is that this hierarchical vision of things allows us in our legal and ethical lives to attribute special value, graded value, to the different levels, and especially to life and mind, so that if you represent the level of matter with the letter M, then plant life has something that matter doesn't. Let's call it X, a kind of element of vitality, which makes it more important and more valuable than just material stuff. Animal life has not only vitality and materiality, but also a kind of sentience and awareness, and even a kind of consciousness. Human consciousness, according to this view of things, is not only composed of material particles, but also has vitality and sentience. And not only that, but self-reflective consciousness, the capacity to be conscious that one is conscious. And this gives mind, which is what we've been talking about, a certain special value in this pre-scientific way of looking at the world. So what's wrong with it? Today, given what we now know about the universe, it has no sense of deep time, or it ignores it. It fails also to acknowledge the gradualism in natural history, that there are no sharp breaks, historically speaking, in the history of nature, between and among these levels. And it has very little interest in the cosmic future, because the future is one of my personal survival with God. It's not my concern what happens to the cosmos after I disappear from it. This view also allows for a kind of separation of souls from nature, which ironically leaves the cosmos sort of destitute of life and mind. And that's the universe, ironically, that the modern archaeonomic vision inherited from traditional otherworldly piety. A universe which had already been turned into a desert, into a deadness, by a kind of escapist religiosity, which is not necessarily true of every version of the analogical vision, but seems to be true of the extreme versions of it. And with these extreme versions of the analogical vision, there are other problems. Doesn't it foster a kind of unrealistic perfectionism and puritanism? And also, isn't it ready-made for patriarchy and for passivity, for our just not worrying too much about the future of the universe, but rather about the future of ourselves? And isn't it a convenient platform for clericalism? A convenient system of heroics for climbing from one status to a higher one? And aren't there ecological liabilities here? That if the ultimate objective of our lives and our destiny is to get away from this cosmos altogether, why should we care about it and its long-range future? And I can't go into this in any detail, but I have a strong belief that the current crisis in Catholicism has a lot to do with a kind of fixation on this analogical vision of things. Well, if that's not so good, then what about the archaeonomic reading of the universe, the analytical one, which has become almost the default position of those who are sick of and tired of the analogical way of looking at things? Is there any other alternative for many of them than the archaeonomic vision? No, for most of them there isn't. So they go back to that as the default position. But even though it seems intellectually attractive because it allows us to take those X, Y, and Z factors I talked about in the last slide and reduce them to M, and thus get a kind of intellectual control over the universe, over nature, that we didn't have before. Even though it makes it a measurable universe, it's still a mindless universe at heart. Life is, as Peter Atkins, British physical chemist, puts it, life is nothing more than simplicity, meaning elemental, mindless, elemental, physical simplicity, masquerading as complexity, which illustrates Jonas's point that in this archaeonomic view, the intelligible par excellence is deadness. So, is this a coherent option as an alternative to the analogical view? I've come to believe that it's not. I believe passionately that it's not only spiritually deadening, but it's also intellectually incoherent. And I've been led to think that way because of my reading over many years of Teilhard's critique of his hard-boiled materialist friends. He thought that materialism, one of the problems is that it squeezes all the juice out of evolution itself and out of the universe. To archaeonomy, the world becomes more and more incoherent the farther back we go in time. So if you take any present example of living complexity and subject it to scientific analysis, that is breaking it down into its component parts, what that leads to is a past in which incoherence rather than coherence can be found. Take any living organism and break it down into its cells, break the cells down into molecules and molecules into smaller molecules, clusters, break them down into atoms, break the atoms down into their subatomic elements. The further back you go, and the further down you go in your analysis, the more you find yourself in a state of sheer diffusion, dispersal, fragmentation. In other words, instead of coherence, you find decoherence. And that's just another word for unintelligibility. So how do you make the world intelligible? Well, there's nothing wrong with that analysis, that's fine. Science is supposed to do that. But after you follow the analytical method all the way back to this remote dispersal, then turn around 180 degrees and start looking toward the future. And then you will see things starting to come together as they move from past to future. You can't really understand an atom until you wait and see what it does in the context of a molecule, or a molecule until you wait and see what it does in the context of a cell, and a cell in terms of an organism. In other words, intelligibility emerges only as you look from the past toward the future. Follow time's arrow from past into the future. And wouldn't that be the case today as well? Especially now that we know the universe is not finished. It's still coming into being, that there might be surprising things on the horizon that we can't even possibly imagine at present. So it's only by looking toward the future that we can even begin to make sense of the universe and to see what's really going on inside. But in order to make a case for this way of looking at things, we need a whole new worldview, different from the archaeonomic, different from the analogical. And that's the one that I'm referring to as anticipatory. And what my book is an attempt to work out in detail what this anticipatory vision would be like with respect to many different phenomena, such as morality and hope for a meaning and question of purpose and evolution and many other things that happen. What do they look like in terms of the anticipatory vision? What you have to do is move the furniture in your mind around from the analogical to the anticipatory. You don't need to dispense with the notion that there is something important going on at all. In fact, you can see the universe as a drama of awakening. And that means that there's a kind of emergent insideness that goes, as I said at the beginning, all the way back to the physics of the early universe. This universe is a drama of awakening. And you don't need to dispense with the hierarchy of traditional thought altogether, but instead see it as an emerging hierarchy, so that in time, matter came first, and then dramatically life emerged and struggled and suffered and complexified, and eventually, not too long ago, mind emerged even more dramatically. And the universe became conscious of itself, as Teilhard de Chardin and Julian Huxley have put it. And then, is the universe, is its awakening over once mind comes about? Or can we not perhaps, and this is my suggestion, locate faith within the context of an emerging universe and thus see it in a completely different way? from the way in which faith has been seen by traditional theology and philosophy and religious thought. Faith is how the universe, now that it has become conscious of itself, awakens to something more, to more being, to fuller being, to a newness on the horizon that has never yet been instantiated or incarnated in the cosmic process, but which can give a meaning to things, for which we have to wait, but a meaning nonetheless. Faith is how the universe awakens to what in the book I refer to as indestructible rightness, which is a term I use to try to summarize all the ideas or ideals that religions since the beginning have been looking toward. Fullness of being, fullness of meaning, fullness of beauty, fullness of truth. And also to the power of the future, which makes this, therefore, a very Abrahamic way of looking at things. So just to summarize then, this world that's still coming into being, rests not on the past, nor is it suspended from eternity and eventually sucked back into eternity. But the world, as Teilhard puts it, these are his words, the world rests on the future. This is his way of flinging his soul against the growing gloom. Transcendence, then, once you realize that the universe is a temporal and not just a spatialized thing, transcendence, that which is more, would take the form of what the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner refers to as the absolute future, the future beyond all futures. That's how he understands God. God, then, as Wolfhart Pannenberg says, is in some real, but not yet fully clarified, how could it be, sense, God is somehow not yet. And faith and spirituality would take the form of wayfaring, hope, and patience. And virtue, which is a word that means power, it means empowerment by our new sense that the universe is unfinished and that the meaning of moral action must have something to do with the bringing about of what is not yet. Let me close with a few lines from this blast beruffled sparrow, thrush, Teilhard de Chardin. What is most vitally necessary to the thinking earth, and earth for him is a term that stands for the whole of nature, by metonymy for the whole universe, the universe. What is most vitally necessary to the future of the universe is faith, and a great faith, and ever more faith. To know that we are not prisoners. To know that there is a way out, that there is air and light and love somewhere beyond the reach of all death. To know this, to know that it is not an illusion nor a fairy tale in terms of this new understanding of the cosmos. That if we are not to perish smothered in the very stuff of our being, this is what we must at all costs secure.